The neighborhood had always prided itself on sameness. Every lawn was trimmed with military precision, every hedge clipped into neat angles, and every driveway was spotless, reflecting the HOA's iron grip over its residents. The Homeowners Association called it aesthetic harmony. But to those who lived under its rule, it was more like a suffocating blanket of conformity. Houses were painted in the same muted tones of beige and grey. Mailboxes were identical, standing at rigid intervals like soldiers in formation. Even seasonal decorations were monitored, allowed only within tightly scheduled windows. Into this world of order rolled something unexpected, a camper van. It wasn't brand new, but it wasn't junk either. Faded but sturdy. With soft cream-colored panels and a band of blue running along its side, it parked in the driveway of one of the modest two-story homes. Its presence stood out immediately. Not because it was offensive, but because it was different. In a place where change was an unwelcome guest, the camper van was loud without making a sound. Neighbors slowed their cars to look at it. Children whispered about it at the bus stop. Some shrugged it off. After all, what was a vehicle if not just another mode of transport? But not everyone could dismiss it so easily. Karen couldn't. Karen was the self-appointed enforcer of everything the HOA valued. With her clipboard clutched tightly against her chest, she patrolled the sidewalks like a general inspecting her troops. She took note of everything: grass blades longer than 2 inches, recycling bins left out past pickup, flower colors outside the approved palette. In her mind, she wasn't just a neighbor, she was the guardian of order. And the camper van? To her, it was chaos on wheels. From the moment it appeared, she saw it as a threat to the carefully crafted identity of the neighborhood. To Karen, a camper van meant transience, unkempt living, and the possibility of rebellion against HOA authority. She glared at it each time she passed, her lips pressed into a thin line, her pen scratching furiously at her clipboard. The first letter arrived within a week. It was polite at first, dressed in formal language, citing clauses and rules about non-conforming vehicles and neighborhood standards. The camper van, according to the HOA, was an eyesore that violated the aesthetic code. The homeowner was given 10 days to remove it, but the camper van didn't move. Another letter followed, sharper in tone, warning of fines. Karen stormed past the driveway daily, muttering under her breath as if the mere act of defiance was a personal insult. To her, it wasn't just about the van. It was about control, and control was something she was unwilling to lose. The homeowner, however, remained unshaken. The van stayed parked, its windows catching the morning sun, its blue stripe gleaming faintly under the streetlights at night. What had begun as simple convenience, parking a vehicle in the driveway, was slowly becoming a silent statement of resistance. The neighborhood began to divide. Some whispered that it was foolish to poke the HOA bear. Others quietly admired the defiance. A few secretly wished they had the courage to do the same. But the loudest voice, of course, belonged to Karen. She ramped up her patrols, snapping photos from every angle. She lobbied other board members, insisting that if the camper van was allowed to stay, the neighborhood would descend into disorder. "What's next?" she cried at meetings. "Boats in driveways? Rusting cars on lawns? Chickens in backyards?" Her fury grew, but so did the camper van's presence. The owner began making small adjustments. A set of planters appeared beside it, framing the driveway with bursts of color. A string of soft lights was draped along its side, glowing warmly in the evening. What was once just a vehicle began to take on the shape of something more, an extension of home, a piece of identity, a quiet rebellion against uniformity. And as these small touches appeared, so did the attention of neighbors. A curious few stopped to chat, lingering near the van, as if drawn by its quiet charm. The HOA may have hated it, but for others, it became a symbol of something refreshing, a break from monotony, a whisper of individuality in a place that demanded sameness. Karen's frustration boiled over. She issued complaints, threatened fines, and launched tirades in board meetings, but each day, the camper van remained, and each day, it seemed to stand a little taller, casting a longer shadow over the HOA's authority. The tension thickened. The van had become more than a parked vehicle. It was now the heart of a battle over control, freedom, and the right to simply exist differently. The stage was set for escalation, and everyone knew it. The HOA's letters grew bolder, Karen's glares sharper, and whispers among neighbors louder. And yet the camper van didn't move. It stood quietly in the driveway, a silent but powerful act of defiance. The neighborhood waited, bracing for what would come next, because this was no longer about a vehicle. This was about who truly owned the right to shape their lives, the people who lived there, or the board that ruled them. And as the tension reached its peak, the homeowner was already planning the next move. Something far bigger, far bolder, and far more permanent than anyone, especially Karen, could have imagined. The camper van was about to transform, and with it, the entire neighborhood would change forever. The van had started as nothing more than a parked inconvenience in the eyes of the HOA, but by the time the second month rolled around, it had grown into something much larger in meaning. The homeowner no longer saw it as just a vehicle, but as a stage, a canvas, a possibility. And every glare from Karen, every letter stuffed into the mailbox, only hardened that sense of resolve. The fines began to arrive in regular waves. They started small, $50, then $100, but quickly escalated, climbing into the hundreds. The HOA thought pressure would eventually break the will of any resident. It was their oldest and most trusted tactic. For years, neighbors had folded under it, surrendering bird feeders, porch swings, or garden gnomes at the mere hint of a financial penalty. But this was different. Instead of shrinking, the camper van began to grow in purpose. One morning, neighbors woke to the sight of a small awning attached to its side, striped fabric fluttering in the breeze. Beneath it stood a simple folding table, and on that table, a coffee pot hissed and steamed. At first it seemed like a casual gesture, someone enjoying their morning outside, perhaps. But then came the aroma, rich, earthy, inviting. It carried down the street, drifting into driveways, wrapping around mailboxes, and slipping under the noses of early walkers. Soon enough, the first neighbor stopped. Then another. A cup was offered, poured steaming and fresh into simple mugs. It wasn't long before the whispers spread. The camper van was serving coffee. What had been a static symbol of resistance became, almost overnight, a gathering place. Parents stopping on their way to school drop-offs, joggers pausing mid-route, retired couples strolling arm in arm. One by one, they drifted toward the driveway, drawn by the promise of something warm and different. The HOA had rules against unapproved businesses, but the transformation was clever. It wasn't advertised. There were no signs, no prices scrawled on chalkboards. It looked, at least at first, like simple hospitality, a neighbor offering a cup of coffee to another. Harmless, friendly, ordinary, but to Karen it was anything but. She saw what others did not, or perhaps refused to. She saw a threat spiraling out of control. The van had not only survived her campaign, it was thriving. Worse still, people were gathering, smiling, laughing. They weren't just tolerating the camper van, they were celebrating it. Each cup of coffee poured felt like a knife twisting against the HOA's authority. Karen doubled her efforts. She documented every cup handed out, snapping photos, cataloguing faces. She filed complaint after complaint with the board, demanding action. In her reports, she didn't call it a coffee table or friendly neighborly exchange. She called it unauthorized commerce, public nuisance, grounds for removal. She filled her clipboard with evidence, convinced that one more submission would finally break the board's hesitation. But she underestimated something crucial, the power of community. The more Karen fought, the more people rallied to the van. It wasn't just about coffee anymore. It was about choice, about defying the suffocating sameness that had ruled them for years. For the first time in a long time, neighbors lingered in driveways, exchanged stories, laughed openly without fear of citation. The transformation accelerated. The homeowner painted the van's side, replacing its faded cream with a clean coat of white. Over that white came bold splashes of blue and green, a mural that seemed to pulse with life. Coffee beans, swirling steam, vines and leaves, all painted with care, all in defiance of the beige monotony surrounding it. Then came more tables, sturdier ones. Folding chairs appeared. A chalkboard finally did go up, but instead of prices, it read in big, cheerful letters, "Neighbors, welcome." By the third week, it wasn't just a table and an awning. It was a front yard cafe. The HOA scrambled to respond. Official notices were stuffed into envelopes, written in the stiffest language possible: cease and desist, violation of bylaws, immediate removal required. Karen's voice grew shriller at meetings, her demands more desperate. She painted apocalyptic visions of property values plummeting, of outsiders invading their streets, of chaos spreading unchecked. And yet, every morning the line at the camper van grew longer. News traveled fast, not just within the neighborhood but beyond it. Friends told friends, social media posts appeared, photos of steaming cups held against the backdrop of a painted van, hashtags celebrating the little cafe that could. Soon, cars that didn't belong to the neighborhood began to pull up. Not many at first, just a trickle, but each one sent Karen into another spiral of fury. The board tried escalation. They sent formal threats of legal action. They levied fines so large they seemed almost laughable, but the more they pushed, the more publicity the cafe gained. Local news stations caught wind of the story. HOA battles resident over camper van cafe. Cameras arrived, filming the mural, interviewing smiling neighbors clutching their coffees. The HOA had wanted silence. Instead, they had created a stage. Karen was relentless. She marched from porch to porch, urging neighbors to sign petitions, to call the cafe an eyesore, to condemn it as unlawful. But each knock on a door revealed something she hadn't expected. People weren't on her side anymore. Some shut their doors in her face. Others openly told her they enjoyed the cafe, that it had brought life and friendliness to a street that had long been sterile and cold. The tide was turning. The HOA still held power, but its grip was slipping. Rules and fines meant little when the community they were meant to control began to see them as the enemy. What once seemed like an unbreakable order was starting to fracture under the weight of something as simple as coffee and conversation. And still the cafe grew. Umbrellas sprouted over tables. A small shelf appeared, lined with muffins and pastries from a local baker who saw an opportunity to partner. Musicians began to drop by with guitars, playing soft tunes in the evenings, while neighbors lingered under strings of lights. What had begun as one person's silent act of defiance was now a movement, pulsing with energy and joy. Karen's fury burned hotter than ever. She filed police reports hoping they would intervene, but without a clear crime, the officers shrugged, some even taking a cup of coffee before they left. She threatened lawsuits, but lawyers advised the board that a case might not stand, especially with public opinion stacked against them. The HOA, once untouchable, now looked foolish, petty, even powerless. And Karen, once feared, was beginning to look ridiculous. But Karen wasn't done. She refused to be outshined by a van and a pot of coffee. She began digging deeper, researching zoning laws, pestering city officials, calling health inspectors. If the HOA couldn't shut it down directly, perhaps the city could. She stayed up late at night, her kitchen table buried under papers, highlighters, and binders full of rules. She would find something, anything that could drive the campervan cafe out once and for all. The homeowner, meanwhile, kept building. Not just tables and murals, but momentum. What had started as a single spark of defiance was now a roaring flame of community. Neighbors who had once feared the HOA were now emboldened. They painted their doors brighter colors, planted flowers outside the approved palette, and left yard decorations in place without guilt. The cafe had become a symbol, not just of resistance, but of freedom. And freedom, once tasted, was impossible to forget. The battle lines were clear. On one side stood the HOA, led by Karen with her clipboard and her fury. On the other stood the cafe, glowing warmly in the evenings, humming with laughter, powered by nothing more than coffee and courage. Everyone in the neighborhood knew the storm was far from over, because Karen wasn't just angry, she was desperate. And desperation, in someone like her, meant escalation was inevitable. The van had become more than a nuisance. It was a revolution. And revolutions, once begun, never stop quietly. The cafe had become more than a driveway project. It was no longer just a camper van with coffee. It was the beating heart of the neighborhood, pulsing every morning with chatter, laughter, and the clink of mugs. The aroma of freshly ground beans drifted through the streets, pulling people in like a tide. And with every pour, every smile, every story shared, The HOA's authority slipped further away. But Karen was not one to surrender. She was a fighter, or perhaps more accurately, a clinger, clinging desperately to control, to her sense of superiority, to her vision of what the neighborhood should be. And in her eyes, the cafe was not just a violation of rules, it was a personal humiliation, a reminder that she had lost. Her clipboard became a weapon sharper than a sword. She prowled the streets at dawn, scribbling notes about traffic, about noise, about imagined trash. She sent complaints to the HOA board daily, each letter longer, angrier, more frantic than the last. But the board had begun to tire of her. Their inboxes overflowed with her reports, their meetings dragged under her tirades. And though they still issued fines, those fines were ignored, unpaid, laughed off by neighbors who now openly mocked their power. So Karen shifted her fight elsewhere. She called the city's zoning department, insisting that the cafe was operating illegally as a business. She called the health department, claiming food safety violations. She called the fire marshal, declaring that extension cords and string lights posed imminent hazards. Each agency, dutifully responding, came to investigate. But when they arrived, they found compliance. The van had been prepared. Permits had been secured quietly, strategically one step ahead of Karen's fury. Health inspectors left with satisfied checkmarks and, more than once, complimentary muffins in their hands. Karen's fury grew. The more she tried to tear down the cafe, the more legitimate it became. The homeowner had anticipated her every move. The coffee wasn't free anymore, but it wasn't expensive either. Money exchanged hands openly, a small register perched on the counter. Receipts printed neatly, everything by the book. Each attempt to find fault only polished the cafe's legitimacy further. Neighbors marveled at it. The van that had once drawn glares now drew respect. Local reporters returned, now with larger crews, filming segments that showed the cafe as a model of grassroots entrepreneurship. Headlines praised it. HOA war backfires. Driveway cafe becomes town treasure. Articles contrasted Karen's hostility with the community's warmth, painting her as a villain in a story she had written for herself. But Karen refused to retreat. If the city would not act, she would escalate further. She pushed the HOA to file lawsuits, to demand court injunctions. She pestered lawyers, shouted at meetings, waved photos in people's faces. Her obsession consumed her. While the cafe bloomed, Karen withered. Her days became filled with paperwork, her nights restless with plotting. Her once pristine home began to fray around the edges, lawns unmowed, paint chipping, mail piled high, while she chased an enemy she could not defeat. The contrast was glaring. Across the street the cafe sparkled brighter each week. String lights glowed in the evenings, casting golden warmth on neighbors seated at tables, their laughter echoing into the night. Musicians strummed guitars under the stars, families shared pastries, children drew chalk art on the pavement without fear of reprimand. It was more than coffee now. It was community reborn. And Karen? She watched from her window, seething, her world shrinking as theirs expanded. Yet, the story was not finished. The HOA did take the matter to court eventually. They argued violations of property use, of bylaws, of contractual obligations tied to the neighborhood. They demanded the van be removed, the cafe shut down, the homeowner fined into submission. But the courtroom was not the HOA's meeting room. It was a public space with cameras, reporters, and witnesses, and when the case was heard, it became not just a legal dispute, but a spectacle. Neighbors filled the benches, many wearing shirts emblazoned with the cafe's mural. Reporters scribbled notes as testimonies were given. The homeowner's lawyer argued not just legality, but fairness, pointing to permits, to community support, to the absurdity of banning a cafe that harmed no one and served so many. Karen testified too, her voice sharp, her words venomous. She painted the cafe as a blight, as chaos, as the death of order. But the more she spoke, the more unhinged she seemed. Her anger spilled over, her bitterness transparent. She wasn't defending the neighborhood, she was defending her pride. When the judge's decision came, it was clear and final. The cafe could stay. The HOA's claims were dismissed as overreach. The van was not only legal but protected under local business ordinances. The cafe was free to operate without interference. The courtroom erupted in quiet applause, restrained but undeniable. Reporters rushed outside, neighbors hugged one another, and the story made headlines again. HOA loses battle. Driveway Café declared legal victory. It was the final blow. Back in the neighborhood, the café celebrated with a festival. Tables overflowed with pastries. Musicians played louder than ever. Children painted signs that read, "Our Café, our choice." Cars from outside the community lined the street, visitors eager to sip from the van that had defied an entire board. The HOA retreated. Meetings grew sparse, their letters slowed, their power fractured. And Karen, once the loudest voice, the self-appointed enforcer of order, was now a shadow. She still lived there, still clutched her clipboard from time to time, but her voice no longer commanded fear. Neighbors looked past her, through her, or simply ignored her altogether. She had become irrelevant, an echo of a time when control mattered more than joy. The cafe, meanwhile, thrived. What began as a single coffee pot under an awning became a permanent fixture. The camper van, once parked quietly, now stood proudly painted with fresh murals every season. The driveway bloomed with potted plants, string lights, and laughter. On weekends, lines stretched down the street. The van was no longer just a cafe. It was a landmark, a point of pride, a symbol etched into the neighborhood's identity. And so the battle ended, not with silence but with music, not with control but with freedom. The HOA had tried to crush individuality, but instead they had inspired something far greater than themselves. The camper van cafe was not just resistance, it was victory, community, and change. The irony lingered like steam above a fresh cup. Karen had hated the van. She had called it an eyesore, a nuisance, a violation. She had tried to erase it from existence. And yet her fury, her complaints, her endless war had done the opposite. She had made it famous. She had made it strong. She had turned it from a parked vehicle into a legend. Every time the blades of string lights glowed, every time a cup of coffee was poured, every time neighbors gathered to laugh under the mural-covered van, they remembered the story. The story of how one woman's hatred had brewed the sweetest victory. The HOA had tried to bury it, but instead they had planted a cafe,